Hello again. Here we are back in Acts chapter 27 in our series of the four anchors that were dropped in Paul's shipwreck. We first have talked about the first anchor being God's presence, and the second message then we talked about the second anchor is God's peace. And tonight we're going to talk about the third anchor, which is God's protection. God's protection. The result of God's presence and peace was his protection and also power, but we're going to talk more about protection. And we know that Paul and the whole crew were spared their lives. We know this because the last line of the text there in Acts 27, it says, "And so it was all that all were brought safely to land." I want to back up just 2 years before in Acts 23, where Paul had been arrested, and he was in Rome, and he was in Jerusalem, and we know that it was God's will that Paul would go to testify to Rome and to give testimony of his faith before Caesar, because it says in Acts 23 verse 11 that the following night the Lord stood near Paul and said, "Take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." And then it's interesting that the angel here, an angel sent from the Lord, appeared on the ship. Paul probably needed a reminder. He had that promise that he was going, that God had destined for him. It was God's will for Paul to go to Rome. God wanted Caesar to hear the gospel and to hear Paul's conversion story. And so, but perhaps Paul needed some reassurance, and so he sent this angel to remind him of that. But I wanted to just talk about this experience that Paul had, and the angel had told him. You see, because the angel that the Lord first had stood beside him in Caesarea, in Jerusalem rather, and said that you're going to go to Rome. It's my will that you testify there. We know that then while Paul was in Jerusalem before going to Caesarea, there were 40 men who took a vow not to eat or drink until they had assassinated Paul. Scripture tells us that their plan failed as Paul was taken to Caesarea under protection of the Roman soldiers. But because God had willed for Paul to speak before Caesar in Rome, Paul in a sense was immortal. There could have been an ambush of not 40 but 40,000 men against Paul, and they still would not have succeeded. Why? Because God had willed, God had said, "You will go," and God has the last word. And so it's just kind of interesting that in that time, I believe it was John Piper who said the phrase that Paul was immortal, and he was. I mean, and the good thing also for these people on the ship, these other passengers on the ship, we don't know if that was the case for them or not, but because they were with Paul, they got the benefits that Paul, it was destined for Paul to go to Rome. And so if God is going to protect all of the ship and Paul, then everybody else got the benefit from that. They were probably glad to be on the ship and that to receive this spillover benefit from Paul's being predestined to go to Rome to preach the gospel. Several years ago, I was reading a story, beautiful story, happened, a true story in World War II, and this is taken from, written by a soldier in the U.S. Army, 35th Infantry Division, in the 137th Infantry Company 1. His name is Spencer January, and this was taken from a Guidepost magazine. It was a morning early in March 1945 on a sunny day. I was 24 years old and a member of the U.S. Army's 35th Infantry Division. Along with several other companies of American troops, we were making our way through dense woods towards the Rhine River in the German Rhineland. Our objective was to make and take the town of Ossenburg, where a factory was producing gunpowder and other products used in war. For hours we pressed through an unrelenting thicket. Shortly after midday, word was passed that there was a clearing ahead. At last, we thought, the going would be easier. But when we approached a large stone house, behind which huddled a handful of wounded, bleeding soldiers who had tried to cross the clearing and had failed. Before us stretched at least 200 yards of open ground, bordered on the far side by more thick woods. And the first of us appeared on the edge of the clearing, there was an angry rat-tat-tat and a ferocious volley of bullets sent soil spinning as far as we could see. There were 3 nests of German machine guns, spaced 50 yards apart and protected by the crest of a small hill to the left, where firing across the field. As we got our bearings, it was determined that the machine guns were so well placed that our weapons could not reach them. To cross that field at that time meant suicide. Yet, we had no choice. The Germans had blockaded every other route going into the town. In order to move on and secure a victory, we had to move forward. There were no options. I slumped against a tree, appalled by the grim situation. I thought of home, of my wife and my 5-month-old son. I had kissed him goodbye just after he was born. I thought that I might never see my family again, and the possibility was overwhelming. I dropped to my knees. "Oh God," I pleaded desperately, "you've got to do something. Please do something." Moments later, the order was given to advance. Grasping my N1 rifle, I got to my feet and started forward. After reaching the edge of the clearing, I took a deep breath. But just before I stepped out from cover, I glanced to my left. I stopped and stared in amazement. A white cloud, a long, fluffy, thick white cloud, had appeared out of nowhere. It dropped over the trees and covered the area. The Nazis' line of fire was obscured by the thick, foggy mist. All of us bolted into the clearing and raced for our lives. The only sounds were of combat boots thudding against the soft earth as men dashed into the clearing, scrambling to reach the safety of the other side before the mist lifted. With each step, the woods opposite came closer and closer. I was almost across. My pulse pounded in my ears. I lunged into the thicket and threw myself behind a tree. I turned and watched as other soldiers followed me, dove frantically into the woods, some carrying and dragging the wounded. This has to be God's doing, I thought. The instant the last man reached safety, the cloud vanished. The day was again bright and clear. The enemy, apparently thinking that we were still pinned down behind the stone house on the other side, must have radioed their artillery, because only a few minutes later that building was blown to bits. But our company was safe, and we quickly moved on. We reached Ossenberg and went on to secure more areas for the Allies. But the image of that cloud on that day was never far from my mind. I had seen the sort of smoke screens that were sometimes set off to obscure troop activity in such situations. That cloud had been totally different. It had appeared out of nowhere, and it saved our lives. 2 weeks later, as we bivouacked in eastern Germany, a letter arrived from my mother back in Dallas, Texas. I tore open the envelope eagerly. The letter contained words that sent a shiver down my spine. "You remember Mrs. Tankersley from our church," my mother wrote. "Who could forget her?" I smiled. "Everybody called Miss Tankersley the prayer warrior." "Well," continued Mom, "Mrs. Tankersley telephoned me one morning from the defense plant where she works. She said the Lord had awakened her the night before at 1 o'clock and told her, 'Spencer is in terrible trouble. Get up now and pray for him.'" My mother went on to explain that Mrs. Tankersley had interceded for me in prayer until 6 o'clock the next morning when she had to go back to her job. She told me the last thing that she prayed before getting off her knees was this: "Lord, whatever danger Spencer is in, just cover him with a cloud." I sat there for a long time holding the letter in my trembling hand. My mind raced, quickly calculating. Yes, the hours Mrs. Tankersley was praying would indeed have corresponded to the time that we were approaching that clearing. With a 7-hour time difference, her prayer for a cloud would have been uttered exactly at 1 o'clock, the exact time the company and I was getting ready to cross the clearing. From that moment on, I intensified my prayer life, and for the past 52 years, I have gotten up early every morning to pray for others. I am convinced there is no substitute for the power of prayer and its ability to comfort and sustain others, even those facing the valley of the shadow of death. What a powerful testimony of God's protection. Of course, that's so related to prayer, but it was obviously God's will for this soldier and his company to cross that clearing, and through prayer, his will was made to come into effect, and he sent that cloud to protect them. John Piper has written a lot about suffering and persecution, and I quote him as he talks about Paul and Silas. In this age, God rescues his people from some harm, but not all harm. And I think these words are especially important in these days of the COVID-19. See, not everybody is surviving. We know that. Almost 1,000 people are dying here in Spain every day. In the United States, those numbers are climbing everywhere all over the world. You see, God rescues his people from some harm, but not all harm. That's comforting to know, because otherwise we might conclude from our harm that he has forgotten us or rejected us. So be encouraged by the simple reminder. So we look at Acts chapter 16. In verses 19 through 24, Paul and Silas were not delivered. But in verses 25 and 26, they were. First, there was no deliverance. Verse 19 says, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace. Verse 22, the magistrates tore their garments off of them. Verse 23, they inflicted many blows upon them. And in verse 24, the jailer fastened their feet in the stocks. But then, we know the story, came deliverance. About midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and suddenly there was a great earthquake, so that the foundations of the prison were shaken. And immediately all the doors were open, and everyone's bonds were unfastened. God could have stepped in sooner. He didn't. He has his reasons. He loved Paul and Silas all throughout the story. And here's the most important question for us. If you plot your life along this continuum of Paul's initial suffering and later deliverance, where are you right now? Where am I? Are you in the stripped and beaten stage, or the unshackled, the door flung open stage? Both are God's stages of care for you. He has not left you or forsaken you. And if you are in the fettered stage, don't despair. Sing. That's what Paul and Silas were doing. Freedom is on the way. It is only a matter of time. And then I love this part, what Piper says. It says, freedom is on the way. It is only a matter of time, even if it comes through death. We don't think much about that. But sometimes freedom and deliverance comes through death. Jesus said, be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. And I'm reminded that Paul and Peter and others were rescued from prison miraculously, but John the Baptist was not. In these times, we need to remember that God is our fortress, our strength, our protection, our ever-present help in time of need. He is our shield, our tower, and our fortress. And we need to cling, and we need to throw out and let down this anchor, the third anchor of protection, knowing that we are in his hands and that he has plans for us, he has a will for us. And if any of us are like Paul in a sense, we don't know for sure. We don't know. God knows. God knows how long everyone is going to live. And because God had destined for Paul to go to Rome and to speak, in that time he was immortal. And in a sense, until the appointed time that God has for all of us, we're immortal also. Now we don't know when that time is going to be up. But we need to remember that Jesus wants the best for us. The great Scottish pastor, and I'll close with this, Robert Murray M'Cheyne said, "If I could hear Christ praying for me in the next room, I would not fear a million enemies. Yet distance makes no difference. He is praying for me." Let's lower this third anchor of God's protection and rest in His protection. God bless you.